Hi, I'm Rebecca de Souza. I'm a D4 researcher here at Oxford in Spanish.
Hi, I'm Lottie. I'm a first year Spanish student at Exeter College.
Hi, I'm Hector. I do French and Spanish in fourth year at Castigo.
So today we're going to be discussing a play by Lope de Vega, who is probably the most prolific playwright in the early modern period in Spain. The play is called Castigo sin venganza, or Punishment Without Revenge. It was written in 1631, so towards the end of Lope's career, and is considered to be one of his most famous and well-known plays. So the play itself tells the story of the Duke of Ferrara. So the Duke is a nobleman in Italy, and we learn about his relationship with his illegitimate son, Federico. The Duke doesn't have the best reputation. He doesn't want to get married, but he's eventually forced to get married in order to produce a legitimate heir. So he marries a woman named Cassandra. Cassandra then, in fact, falls in love with his son, Federico. So it's a tale of semi-incest, but not quite, and also essentially adultery. And we join the text now with an extract at the end of the play. So this is in the third act, and it's a discussion between Federico and his father. Federico is none the wiser, but his father realises that he's actually had an affair with his stepmother Cassandra, and this is where we join the text. So do you want to maybe just explain what's happening in this scene?
Sure. So essentially the king has received an anonymous letter informing him of his son's love affair with his wife, and here he's like taken the wife and like bound her up, and he tells his son that he wants him to kill some unknown traitor in the name of his father, and then the audience know that is Cassandra, and here we see him trying to convince him to carry out the murder.
Yes, exactly. So I think what we see here before we get into the key themes of the text is basically a relationship between father and son at its core. So what does this extract really tell us about their relationship?
It's slightly dysfunctional. It's not the kind of father-son relationship we like to aspire to today. The way they address each other definitely shows that there's a power dynamic in which Federico is the subordinate, and his father, the Duque, is obviously much more dominant. And that comes through in the kind of language that he uses. At one point, he even calls him like a dog or a scoundrel, Duque de Federico, which is quite telling.
Yes, exactly. So you can see that although there is a kind of awkward power dynamic between them, there is love between them as well. So there is that father and son relationship. But as you say, the power is very much in balance between the two. And although they are discussing a sort of personal matter here, there is a sense of a wider society at play, and a wider society that both of them are concerned about. Can you notice any of that in their discussion?
The use of the third person plural.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting.
It really comes through in the first year course at Oxford. We study an honour play by Calderon, and there's a nice phrase that sums it up, lo que dirán, what other people will say about something. And I think that comes through in the sense of a kind of unnamed third party that's always like a silent listener, a spectre of the feast in every engagement between two people.
And that's like the relationship between private matters and like public life, and how, because of their status, this takes on a much wider meaning that perhaps it can't be settled privately because it concerns the like wider public.
Yes, exactly. I mean, even as the extract starts off, Federico's talking about common news around the palace, about an unrelated relationship of Aurora, who was his intended wife, is now going to marry the Marquis Gonzaga. And that just shows you that there is this much wider society that they are concerned about, and that is affecting their every decision. So in terms of, I guess, going back to their roles as father and son, what other roles can you see them actually fulfilling here? Not just father and son. Do they play any other roles in the society in which they live?
So I think to an extent, Federico, even though he's an illegitimate son, because his father is the Duke, will always be a representative for him, and should Federico dishonour himself, he therefore dishonours his father by extension. I think perhaps that to a certain extent there's maybe an Oedipal element to this as well. In fact, it is Oedipal because Federico has slept with his mother-in-law. So I think there's also that undercurrent throughout the passage.
Yes, exactly. And I guess how do these extra roles that they take on in society, how does that affect their personal relationship? So how does, I guess, the public self start to affect the private in this extract?
Well, I feel like because it has public consequences, what happens, it feels less like a simple father and son relationship, more like there is more of a power dynamic between the two of them, because the father does have to protect his place in society, and everything his son does reflect onto him. So rather than simply being able to resolve their matters privately, there becomes like a much bigger, larger consequence to anything that happens between them.
No, it's interesting that you say that, actually, if we look closer at the longest speech by the Duke here. So he's obviously explaining, as you noted at the beginning, that he's tied up somebody who's he's claiming to be a nobleman, a treacherous nobleman. It is in fact Cassandra, but Federico doesn't know this. And he's describing the punishment that he'd like Federico to mete out on this nobleman. But the type of punishment that he's talking about is in fact quite private. So he mentions, so it was easy to tie him to the chair and cover him so that the one who comes to kill him will not see his face, and spread the news all over Italy. So the Duke is very concerned that in fact this could become a public matter, but he'd rather keep this private. And in this situation, why might he think so?
Well, that's an interesting underplay, because I feel like he has to say that in order to justify his hiding the face, because he's hidden the face so that the son doesn't see it's Cassandra. But I feel like if he were actually killing a traitor, he might want the face to be seen, to know that he has, brought justice on someone who's threatened his rule. So I feel like that makes it kind of suspect, and you do see later that Federico does question it a few times, like why he has to carry out this murder. So maybe there's some sort of dichotomy there.
Yes, yeah, exactly. It already seems quite suspect, as you say, in the usual remit of a duke. If he were threatened by another man who was treacherous, then he would potentially do this more publicly in order to enhance his reputation and solidify himself as I guess the one with the power in this case. But here it is very much private. Yes, you mentioned how it gets, as we get to the end of the extract, Federico does start in fact to get slightly suspicious, and the language here changes quite significantly. So I wonder if you could talk about that, how I suppose they begin quite measured, having quite a regular conversation, but how does the language change towards the end?
We've got the insult from the Duke in his last piece of dialogue in the scene, o perro. But more than that, we've got in the previous line from the Duke, quédate infame. So again, like infamous person, adding the insults, and it seems particularly cobarde as well. I think maybe even that's worse than the two that follow, because part of this honour culture in Golden Age Spain, and to an extent in 17th century Italy, 16th century Italy, would be this culture of what we now call toxic masculinity, I guess, whereby for a man to not show complete ruthlessness in a given situation would have him labelled as kind of less of a man.
Yes, I think there's also like an increase in the number of imperatives. Like it becomes more of an emphasis on it being an order rather than a favour. So like vete, or there's another one, quédate. Yeah.
And even from Federico as well as from the Duke. So I guess Federico is trying to give as good as he gets, and it's just kind of ramping up the tension in the scene.
Yes, no, exactly, and as you say, it's almost a breakdown of this veneer of honour and acceptable public masculinity, and by the end you can actually see the real emotion coming through there, and you can see Federico in fact breaking down. He says, "Me está temblando el alma." His very soul is trembling inside of him. So he can definitely he essentially neglects this role to be the Duke's son and to be the strong avenger essentially of his father, and he breaks down towards the end of the scene. So again, that just shows essentially the mutability of these roles in society, and the fact that masculinity is potentially, as you say, questioning this toxic masculinity, which we would now today call toxic masculinity, in the father-son relationship here. So I think one of the big critical questions really with this play comes back to morality, really, quite bluntly, and people still disagree on who is in the right and who is in the wrong. So knowing the wider context of the play, knowing that the Duke starts the play and continues actually being quite an immoral man. He's not faithful to his wife, he's not keen to get married, and he doesn't treat her well necessarily. How can we then interpret, I guess, Federico's behaviour and who might be morally right here?
I think it's worth just adding the proviso that when the Duque returns, he does come back with the intention of treating his new wife better. But that doesn't excuse his previous behaviour at all. What do you think, Lottie?
And also on that, we don't actually know whether he would have carried that through. I mean, he came back with the intention of it, but we never get to see whether or not he carried through. And I think it's also worth mentioning the honour code in Spain at the time, so that, just to give like a wider context, essentially, everything that especially your wife did reflected onto a man, and you had to preserve your honour in public. And for that reason, especially given his like high status, I think he was acting under the exigencies not only of his own personal vengeance, but also under public honour. And I think the title is interesting because it draws our attention to whether or not he's acting as punishment without vengeance, because as he states, he's this sort of vessel of heaven, doing God's order by restoring justice. But I think the title, by having the use of like venganza there, draws out, like, makes the reader question to what extent, or the audience question to what extent this is true.
Yes, exactly, and it even also questions the extent to which the Duke is exacting revenge, or even wants to exact revenge, whether this is even his sort of desire at all to do this. So exactly, his behaviour is driven by essentially the 16th, 17th century honour code, and this is exactly why he feels compelled to avenge his dishonour, but at the same time he's trying to balance that with his public life and essentially maintain a kind of decorum and lack of, I guess, drama in the public sphere, really. So yes, I mean, I guess we haven't really broached the question quite yet as to who potentially could be considered moral or immoral here, or do we think that's an irrelevant question for Lope de Vega?
It's a good question. I think for us in 2019, it's very hard to justify in any way any kind of corporal punishment or capital punishment for a crime. So, I mean, from that moral perspective, I don't think it would ever be right to try and justify that. Even with what we said about honour in Golden Age Spain, I think as a human being, despite all the sort of cultural and societal baggage that might have come with the time, I don't think you can let that really dictate your behaviour.
And I think, especially as a modern audience, we'd see the irony of what, like, this tragedy, because he, like, the Duke himself has committed adultery, and yet he's in a position where he has to punish adultery. And I think, from our modern perspective, like, you know, discussion of sexism, we see the kind of double standards in that, and perhaps see the Duke as more immoral than Federico. And also, given that technically the marriage, if Federico had married Cassandra, that might have been a more natural marriage than Cassandra with the Duke, given their age, the similar age, and the age gap between her and the Duke. So maybe, especially as a modern audience, we'd see the Duke as being more immoral, and also having neglected his wife. I think we can see both sides of it more, and away from any kind of influence of the honour code as we are today. I think we'd see the Duke as immoral.
I get the feeling it might have divided a contemporary audience though, which is maybe why Lope was the most sort of revered playwright of the day. Because I can imagine, for example, maybe a noble family going to the doctoral to see this, and maybe the sons and the daughters rooting for Federico, and the mother and the father wanting to sort of maintain the status quo. as almost like to an extent like an exemplary story to be followed type thing.
No, exactly. As you say, it really depends on the perspective of the audience, and also potentially we could think of the perspective we take when we consider each character and in which role we consider them to be playing at any given time. So in this scene particularly, they are father and son, but say the scene was set in a court publicly, we may see them differently and judge their behaviour quite differently depending on the context. So I think we'll come to an end maybe with just a discussion on one of the key motifs that is present in the episode, which is the method of killing and the motif of blindness. So as we're talking about as it potentially being blind to the moral implications and blind to the implications of the honor code, what could be the significance of essentially blinding Cassandra?
Just to come back to Oedipus, who we mentioned, when Oedipus kills his father, he blinds himself. So perhaps, especially with the sort of rediscovery of classical texts in Golden Age Spain, we could see that as an implicit link, even though the person being blinded is different in this story.
Yes, no, exactly. That's a very good link.
It's also a link between the literal blinding of Cassandra and the metaphorical blinding of Federico, in that he doesn't know the act that he's committing. So in that way, both of them are, in one way or another, like figuratively blinded.
Mm. And even the Duke, in his behaviour, could be considered pretty blind to morality and reason.
Yeah, precisely. I think at all levels, all characters can be considered quite blinded and I guess narrow in their vision in this case. But yeah, no, thank you very much. That was a great discussion.